Virginia and had on his attack and had slaughtered families. We would talk to descendants of that on both sides of that event. We would go up to Christiana in Pennsylvania and go on the field where in fact the Christiana rebellion would take place and find those descendants in that area who could talk to us about that. I remember interviewing a man named Ambrose Hopkins, whose father had been a part of this. He had just had a stroke maybe 4 months before, and I had called him to see him, and he had a stroke. And then I went back to when I was going to film. It was like 4 months later. And I thought I'd just stop in and say, just to see how he was doing. And we stopped in. He said, "Aren't you going to interview me?" And I said, "But you're kind of sick." He says, "No, I want you to put your camera on. I want to do this interview." And we put the camera up, and this man who seemed really desperately sick suddenly came alive because he wanted to tell this story. And I realized there's something in the story of these descendants. Now, when I talked about this plan to interview descendants, I had a team of advisors that I was going around talking about this film to, and quite a few of them really told me that that was kind of sacrilegious. I couldn't do that. I couldn't make a film and the main characters in the film talking and telling history were descendants who were telling us these stories that were passed down over generation. I think I had one historian that got really excited about it and said, "This could be a breakthrough." But in fact, in this story, there's only one historian in the film, and he appears only twice. The rest of the film is told by descendants, and there's something very powerful, not only in what they say, but how they deliver the story, how they deliver their story, and the meaning that it has to them, something that they carried for a long time. So there was another part of this film that was a challenge, and that was that it was probably one of the early documentaries done on that was trying to do a dramatic telling of this period, and we felt a lot of responsibility there in the sense that we knew that we could, in the narration, we could handle a lot of the facts and stuff, but at the same time we wanted to. We realized it was a learning experience. It was a way for a general millions of people seeing it at the same time. It was a way for them to become much more comfortable with this conversation of slavery and this time in our past. It's kind of, I didn't realize until I was preparing for this piece, but I've got kind of like a 5-year gap between these films that I've done on this topic. And 5 years later, almost exactly, I found myself watching the premiere broadcast of a film called When the Lion Wrote History, Frederick Douglass, on PBS. And again, I think when we started working in the film, it was right around the time William McFeely had written his major biography on Douglass. And I remember we were having a lot of advisor meetings with lots of people in the room. David was in the room. And there was a real conversation around what this film would be about. And we knew it was going to be about Frederick Douglass, but films are not chronologies. They're not just a collection of facts. They really have to be about something. We had to find some way to organize the story about Douglass. Because we're condensing, this long life into 90 minutes, and I think we came up with something, and it kind of was triggered by, again, something that I read, written by Skip Gates, actually. When he said that he wrote that the absence of a voice helped justify the enslavement of Africans. Africans could have no history, no meaningful text of blackness itself, since they had no true self-consciousness, no power to present or represent their black self. And in that, he also talked about this effort that Douglass took on to find his birth date at the end of his life. And with that in mind, we started to structure a film around Frederick Douglass and his need to not only authenticate his own life, but in many ways kind of, through his own life, represent the life of so many other people who were, in fact, nameless. So this is a brief...
Nothing but an echo The Africans and the descendants of Africans sleep here, under the trees in graves hidden from history. In life, they were valued as property, inventoried in careful lists. In death, they were judged not worthy of a record, a mystery even unto themselves. With no markers, no names, no dates of birth and death.
The birth date of a slave was unimportant. And for many slaves, not knowing when you were born is like not really ever being able to shed bondage.
Born a slave, Frederick Douglass told the story of his life in 3 autobiographies and in hundreds of speeches, all working for the freedom of a people in bondage and ensuring that the details of their daily lives would never be forgotten.
I have never met with a slave who could tell me how old he was. Few slave mothers know anything of the months of the year, nor of the days of the month. They measure the ages of their children by springtime, wintertime, harvest time, planting time. Like other slaves, I cannot tell how old I am. My master allowed no questions to be put to him by which a slave could learn his age.
Knowing who you are, knowing where you came from, knowing your birth date, has to do with knowing your individual identity. For Douglass, knowing his birth date meant knowing who Douglass was, who Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was.
Here Douglass spent the final years of his life in the house he named Cedar Hill, across the river from Washington, D.C. On a spring morning in 1894, a year before his death, he recorded the last entry in his diary. He described a trip to Baltimore to visit a relative of his old slave master. He was still in search of his birth date, a matter Douglass called a serious trouble.
I called yesterday while in Baltimore upon Dr. Thomas Sears and learned the following fact. Captain Aaron Anthony died November 14, 1823.
Working with the recorded death of his slave master, Douglass figured his own birth date as February 1817. But he was wrong. Years after Douglass died, the truth about the birth of the slave Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was discovered in a plantation ledger. Next to his slave name was the date, February 1818.
But I suspect this search for an accurate birth date became a kind of obsession, in part because this was somebody who was always telling his own story and always trying to understand, I suspect, even within himself, how he got from there to here.
I want to show that an era or a life, and we're constantly looking for some way to kind of organize the material. So in fact, it is a coherent story that has some the ability to be a dramatic story as we move through it. In this case, in Roots Resistance, we're looking at a story about resistance. It's not trying to do a long kind of treatment on slavery, but it's really looking at this legacy of resistance and trying to tell that in these series of dramatic stories that take you from early incarnations or representations of it to what might be to a logical end. And in Douglass, we thought that we would organize this film really about his desire to kind of to establish this record, not only of his own life and the whole reason for rewriting and writing his biography, but also how the collections of all his papers and his letters, as well as his biographies, in many ways becomes an authentic record of so many people who had no record at all. and that in some way this is as much a part of what's driving his life as the many different causes that are part of that life. I have some colleagues in the field who talk about, or refer to their work as as creators of what they call master narratives. And I've been on panels with them, and whenever I hear that description of our work, it kind of gives me pause, because I'm obviously uneasy with those references, because I grew up in schools where this idea of master narratives were always kind of taught to me in the classrooms, and I never saw myself included in those narratives. So I think what we are able to do with film this time is to create alternative voices, and I've always felt that in some way the films that I make kind of represent a kind of other way or a different perspective. Because as filmmakers, we basically are, what we're really good at is we're good storytellers and dramatists. And as individuals, we hopefully bring a real perspective to our work. And we also come with some real objective for that work. In my case, I'm interested in bringing a different relationship to history or story to classrooms, and make them available for students to kind of think much more broadly about how not only do you learn history, but how do you use it? How does it become something that becomes a part of your life? And as filmmakers, we use all the tricks of our trade. I mean, we all the things that are part of making a good film, we bring to this work that we do. But we also have to, I think, what makes it individual is we follow the compass of our own kind of moral center. I think that is something that you see in anyone's work, or you would like to see in the work. And in that, we then produce summaries of what often is really complicated and complex periods in time and narratives, or complex eras in American history. I think that I'm more comfortable not calling it master narratives, but really calling it kind of perspective narratives. I think that's what we really are producing. And I think that if it's seen that way and represented that way, it becomes a really valuable tool in classrooms and for teaching. I think we, as a historical documentary filmmaker, and I think others in the field, we're really kind of committed to strong research. I think someone said today it's about research and discovery. So we spend so much time really in stages of research so that we feel like we have an accurate representation of the facts. But those facts are steeped in this kind of rigorous historical research and advisement from scholars and others. But in many ways, we create these, what we think are great stories in history that reflect in many ways our personal kind of relationship to that. I think that for me, the most difficult project that I was on that tried to bring all these things together into what would become more of a sweeping history of America's history of enslavement was the Africans in America series. And again, we're talking about, I think for us, we were trying to condense 300 years of history into 6 hours. And I would think of, in anybody's mind, a pretty difficult and daunting task to take on. Again, we were confronted with, well, how do you organize this? What is going to be the structure in which you're going to organize this? And we felt that we would try to use each hour to kind of track, in some sense, the stages upon which. Well, we started with a statement first, and in fact, the statement was not just a fait accompli for North America and the North American colonies and the colonies that would become the United States. But in fact, there's a gradual process that you could track and watch, not only the codification of slavery into law, but also the representation of it into its freedom documents, and then it becoming a much more entrenched, accepted reality in American society. And then you could move to a place where, in fact, you begin to see that very small minority who begins to resist it, and how that resistance begins to take hold, and at the same time, larger issues of labor and land becoming coming together with this resistance movement, and slowly, and in that kind of perfect storm, you have slavery being at the center of a major conflict in the country, and the end of slavery. And we try and track that piece, but deep within that kind of overall arc, we're also looking at the construction of this whole notion of difference that continues to live in the country, that continues to inform the kind of again, I wanted to kind of comment about a couple of photographs you saw in this piece. Those photographs, I think, that are pretty famous photographs now that they come out of the antiquarium collection. And the interesting thing is I first used them in Roots of Resistance, and when we approached the library to use them, they had a very specific criteria that you had to mention how they were produced and for what purposes they were produced when you used them. We were probably the first film group to come to them and ask to use them. And in Roots of Resistance, we do mention that, in fact, they were used to, as a part of a larger study on the inferiority, to look at these questions of Black inferiority. And we mentioned that in the piece, but consequently, we went back the next year. It was very interesting that was no longer something. When we went back to do Douglas, that was no longer a part of our obligation to use the pictures. They had, at that time, been used many more times, and they took that out of their obligation, for their contractual obligation. The other piece is kind of interesting is when we were doing Roots Resistance, we traveled around the country and we found lots of sites where, in fact, there were remnants of the history still living in the landscape, where you could stumble upon slave cabins in the woods, and they might be kind of weather worn, but we found lots of places where we saw examples of that. We also visited certain plantations, and there were in old plantations, and there were remnants of this slave community still there. We went back 5 years later; a lot of those places were gone. The absence of this presence was even greater. So someone earlier yesterday was talking about the value of these images and the value of the images that we collect to do this work, and how in many ways it could be a very useful tool for a generation today that really kind of enters learning from the point of view of wanting to make media first. And this is something that I'm working on a lot right now, is how do you begin to take the elements that are part of creating these films, the many, many hours and hours of footage and audio tapes and photographs and even research that's in a written form, and make this available in a kind of open source, open content space, so that in fact it can be available in classrooms. Because in many ways, the generation we're looking at today will will more quickly turn to visuals and sound and create a product from that, and from that entry place, you can then take them to the space where you're asking them to do more research, to do more in-depth investigation of what they're trying to say, and that leads to the writing and the reading and the other parts that are part of or that kind of fit the old way in which we would pursue research before. But this is kind of like the entry point for getting them into wanting to look at this. I was talking to David yesterday, and I said, it'd be really great if there were many, many, many more younger people interested in the study of this history. I mean, it's really important that it becomes a comfortable conversation and exploration for young students today. And in many cases, when we were doing the audience kind of survey work to kind of get in the sense of how young people were going to respond to the Africans American series, many of them really didn't want to hear anything about slavery. It was only when we started bringing those groups back in and having them look at our films that they began to find a little bit more comfort with that series. I'm going to leave you with just one clip. It's a short one, and I'm not going to talk, but I'm just going to show it, and then we can take questions. It's just the opening sequence to the Africans in there.
They came from different lands, all facing an uncertain future. English and Ashanti, Mendi and Portuguese, German and Igbo, Fanti and Spaniard, French and Angolan, some seeking adventure or riches or religious freedom. Others were captives, bartered and sold like cattle. Together they would build a nation and struggle over the very meaning of freedom and create the America we have inherited today.
I don't think you can understand race relations today without understanding slavery. Even though people will say, I didn't do it, my father didn't do it, even my grandparents, they didn't do it. One of the things that's essential is to know that slavery is not just a Southern institution, it's an American institution.
What evolves in North America is the belief system where to be black meant to be a slave and to be a slave meant to be black.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. Why is it self-evident? It came from God. They're inalienable. Government secures them. Remarkable document. Didn't apply to black folks. And the man who wrote those words, Thomas Jefferson, kept slaves. He also wrote sometime later to a friend, if there is a just God, we're going to pay for this.
Slavery and freedom existed side by side in this country. I think the issue is, did it always have to be that way? And the early history of America indicates that it probably did not.